O socorro tarda, mas não falha. Depois de dias de suspense, o Congresso americano finalmente aprovou o pacote do Tesouro para salvar o sistema financeiro do colapso, que havia sido rejeitado na segunda-feira passada pela Câmara, gerando pânico e prejuízos no mundo todo. Saiu ainda mais caro do que em sua primeira versão. 150 bilhões de dólares foram acrescentados aos 700 bilhões inicialmente propostos, com a introdução de dispositivos para defender o cidadão da surpresa de novas falências, diminuir os impostos e dar incentivos fiscais a empresas que investirem em pesquisa e desenvolvimento. O economista noriel roubini, de origem iraniana, foi a prever há 2 anos o desastre provocado por um mercado financeiro sem freios, que desde então ele sabia ter os dias contados. Ele nos fala sobre a retomada do papel regulador do Estado neste novo ciclo recessivo que se abre na economia mundial e sobre os longos efeitos da crise nos Estados Unidos, que, no seu entender, não vai sua posição de liderança num mundo multipolar.
So you are called a pessimist, but actually what is happening is much worse than you predicted, right?
Absolutely. I predicted a very severe banking, financial, and economic crisis that has become even worse than my worst nightmares. So I was more of a realist rather than a pessimist.
Yeah. You say that this is not just a mortgage crisis, it's a crisis of the whole financial system. Is this caused by the belief in unfettered markets?
Yes, it was the combination that this administration did not believe in any supervision and regulation of the financial system. The financial system is always greedy, and therefore this combination of not being regulated and the credit excesses and the asset bubble created a bubble that now is collapsing, and the consequences are very, very severe, absolutely.
When the Bush government reversed itself and decided to bail out Wall Street with taxpayers' money, you call that the Socialist Republic of the USA run by comrades Bush, Paulson, and Bernanke. What kind of socialism is that?
In some sense, it's not truly socialism because they are privatizing the profits and the gains, and when the trouble occurs, they're socializing the losses and the costs, and therefore the U.S. taxpayer is going to pay the bill of this $1 trillion, $2 trillion of fiscal cost of bailing out the banks. So it's more like almost like a corporate system rather than a socialist system. It's been captured by the rich, the well-connected, and the Wall Street.
But what does it mean for the market, for capitalism, that the government is actually running some of the main financial companies and manipulating the market as they started doing this week?
Yeah, in some sense, today the U.S. looks like China or the Soviet Union before the reforms, and that's a paradox. This administration was so much free market, laissez-faire, ideological, that they created such a mess financially, economically, that now they have to go all the way to the other extreme with massive amount of government intervention. If they'd been more sensible and had prudential supervision of financial institutions, we would not have created this mess, we would not have so much government intervention. So they've gone from one extreme all the way to the other one. That's a paradox.
But some people saw that with relief because they are doing something. But can that be successful, that intervention?
Everything they've done so far was not really working because it was piecemeal, plugging one hole when the entire system of levies in this financial storm was collapsing. The last decision, the one of maybe working out the debts, taking them from the banks, reducing the face value so that homeowners who are distressed stay in their homes, don't lose their homes. I think that may work because the fundamental problem of the U.S. economy, there is too much debt of the households, mortgages, credit cards, auto loans, student loans. Until you reduce the debt burden, they're not going to be able to spend and we'll have a recession. Therefore, you need a debt reduction. When Argentina had too much debt, they defaulted, they reduced the debt, they grew. Same thing for a household. U.S. houses are insolvent, you need to reduce the debt so they can start spending again.
Congress is giving the government the money to do the bailout. What is going to be the cost, the long run for the U.S.?
The exact price we don't know. Estimates suggested it's going to be 1,000 billion US dollars, 1 trillion of the government taking bad assets on its own balance sheet. So that's an approximate initial cost of the bailout. What it means is that if you're going to finance it by issuing debt, there is more debt, and us and our generation of children will have to pay through higher taxes or lower government spending for this huge increase in the public debt. So we're socializing the debt, the losses and the risks. We're taking them away from the private sector, but eventually we'll have to pay it as a private sector because the government will have to tax us in order to finance this deficit.
You talk about the beginning of the decline of the American empire. What do you mean by that?
It is in two ways. Even without this financial crisis, the rise of the economic and financial power of new powers, Brazil, Russia, India, China, other emerging markets, meant that the relative power of the U.S. was falling as you had new economic and eventually also political and geopolitical powers. But on top of it, the decline of the U.S.-American empire is faster because these dangerous policies, twin deficit, budget deficits, current account deficit, financial problems, excessive lending, and now collapse and crisis are going to weaken the economic, financial, and eventually even the political power of the United States. So part of it would have occurred anyhow, part of it is self-inflicted because of the policy mistakes of the United States.
So far, what they call here Main Street, the real economy, producers, consumers, the daily life, hasn't been as hard hit. But will it happen? Will the real economy suffer?
Not as it as the financial system, but we are already in economic recession. The latest data suggests that consumption now has fallen in June, July, August, and September. For the first time in 20 years, we have a consumer-led recession because now the consumers are shopped out, saving less, debt burden, the value of the home is falling, the value of the stock market is falling, employment now has fallen for 8 months in a row, debt ratio are rising, interest on the debt is rising, oil and energy is rising. So the U.S. consumer is on the ropes and on the verge is already a consumer recession. There will be a severe economic recession, slower than the financial one, but we are in a recession. So this is not just the financial crisis, it's also right now economic crisis, and it's going to be a severe recession in the United States.
This is the worst crisis since the Great Depression, but is this going to be as severe and as wild as the Great Depression was?
The BN output is not going to be as big as the Great Depression, but in my view, this economic recession, the fall in output is going to be around 4 or 5% from the peak. That is worse than the last 50 years of recession in the United States. The financial crisis looks as bad as the Great Depression. And on the question whether it's going to become global, this economic recession, I fear there may be a global economic recession. Why? 6 months ago, only U.S. was in a recession, but today, Eurozone, UK, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and other advanced economies are also in a recession. About 50-55% of global GDP now is falling. It's still growing in emerging markets in Latin America and Asia, but with this severity of the U.S. and advanced economy recession, there may be a very severe slowdown of growth, even in emerging market economies. And if that happens, we could have a global recession, not a depression, but certainly a severe global economic recession.
In what sense is this a crisis of the American way of life, as you wrote?
The American way of life was being one in which everybody was spending more than their income, the savings of the household was negative, and they kept on borrowing. And as the value of the home was going higher, they were using their homes as an ATM machine, borrowing against it. And you had built these huge homes, these Mac mansions, where it was too gigantic. Cost of heating now is going up. They're far from the city. Cost of transportation is high. Now there's a collapse of demand for cars because of gasoline prices are $4 a barrel. So the American way of life was suburban, big Mac mansions, big guzzling SUVs, and now both of these things, the two key elements of American way of life, the car and the home, are being in a severe crisis. In that sense, it's a crisis of the American way of life.
Is it also a crisis of capitalism?
It's not a crisis of capitalism itself. I believe that the more successful economies are economies where free markets work properly. But one thing we've learned is that even in free market capitalist economies, you need, first of all, good government that provides good services, and the government has to have appropriate regulation and supervision of the financial markets, because financial markets without proper regulation and supervision is like the law of the jungle. It's like a casino of gambling. And therefore, since Wall Street is full of greed, you have to control that greed by fear of losses, therefore reduce moral hazard, and fear by controlling their behavior. If you don't do it, then you are in trouble. So we believe in market economies, we believe in the efficiency of them, but you need also sound economic and government policy. If you don't have them, then the free market, laissez-faire, becomes the law of the jungle.
But now that the government is bailing out Wall Street, it will actually give them an incentive to keep on doing what they did?
That's one of the risks. When people worry about moral hazard, they worry about the fact that if you privatize gains and socialize the losses, next time around they're going to do the same thing over and over again. In order to avoid it next time around, we need to have better regulation supervision of the banks so that you don't have the same kind of leverage, the same kind of risk-taking, the same kind of production of toxic, new, complex, exotic, illiquid securities. So if you have the proper regulation, you control this problem of moral hazard. Otherwise, it's going to happen another time, another cycle of credit and asset bubble, then it goes into a bust.
On top of the $6 trillion in bonds, the bond market, which supposedly has a collateral, there is this $62 trillion market of what basically are bets. It's hard for me to any lay person to understand it. What is going on there?
Yeah, these are things that were created initially to allow people to hedge themselves against risk. Currency risk, interest rate risk, risk of credit defaults. But they've grown so much, these derivatives, that they are 10 times bigger than the underlying assets. And therefore, this amount of financial innovation has become excessive. There is a lot of risk into it. And therefore, this is an amount of financial intermediation and leverage that is eventually dangerous, that leads to a systemic risk, that if the system, this house of cards of credit and of derivatives collapses, then the problems of Wall Street are going to become the problems of Main Street, of the real economy. That's one of the danger, that financial instability leads then to economic crisis and economic instability. That's why we need proper regulation supervision of financial institutions and of appropriate financial innovation. Too much of it might be dangerous.
This Wall Street model that ruled the financial world for the last decades went bust in a few days. What will replace it?
Certainly Wall Street is going to be completely different. Most of these major broker-dealer investment banks, there were 5 of them left, 3 of them are gone, the other 2 might merge. Many other institutions like banks are going to disappear, hundreds of them. Many of these conduits and SIVs and other strange kind of instruments were just little games. Those have disappeared. Many banks are going to disappear. So it's going to be very different Wall Street when it all settles with more rules, more regulation, more supervision. So it's going to completely change the face of Wall Street and of how we think about managing and regulating financial markets in the US, but also globally.
Does it make a difference if Barack Obama or John McCain is elected? Because they're going to inherit a busted economy, right?
In some sense, yes, because their programs are very different. For example, Obama wants to have a much more active role of the government to deal with the housing problem, the mortgage, the financial crisis. McCain has been of the view, let the market work out. But whenever a severe crisis like this occurs, you need government intervention. They have differences on their tax policy, on their energy policy. So at some level, of course, it makes a meaningful difference who is elected.
Yeah, but either one will inherit collapsed economy. So what can a new president do?
You're right that since they're going to inherit an economic financial crisis, their policies will have to be pragmatic. When you have a mess, you have to do what's right without ideology. So even if McCain is elected, he has to create this new institution to take the bad assets and work them out. Even the Bush administration in favor of this thing, and that's what Obama supports. So at the end of the day, the policies, regardless one is elected or the other, will have to be more central, pragmatic, and what needs to be done. It's enough for the U.S. to have this extreme ideology of laissez-faire capitalism that has led to this disaster. You need moderation, regulation supervision, role of the government, stability, whoever is elected.
For Brazil, a country that began finally to grow in a faster pace and is actually reducing poverty, what is ahead for Brazil?
The problem is that Brazil has done many macro and financial reforms, that's why they're growing. But there are 2 problems. One, the more structural reforms that reduce the micro distortion have not been done, so potential growth is not as high as it could be. 2, there is now a global financial storm, and even a strong country like Brazil is going to be hit. Why? Lower global growth means less exports to Brazil. Lower global growth means the fall in the price of the commodities exports to Brazil. And third of all, there is now risk aversion and panic, and people are pulling out their money from emerging markets. That's going to weaken the stock market, the currency of Brazil. So since we live in a globalized economy where Brazil is part of the global economy, on the way up, you go up with everybody else, but on the way down, there are downside risks to growth. So Brazil, the best thing they can do is to have sound policies. If you have sound policies, you can create a barrier against this major financial and economic storm from the rest of the world. So you have to continue with the reform and having sound economic, monetary, and fiscal policy. At least you are sheltered. You are more immune to the financial contagion.
And sound policies mean the same that are in place?
You need to maintain low inflation. You have to maintain fiscal stability. You have to do a little bit more of the microeconomic reforms. You know, the other BRICS, Russia, China, India, grow 8 to 10%. Brazil, in their best year, was growing about half as much, around 4 to 5%. So the potential growth of Brazil, given the natural resources and the human resources, is high. But in order to grow at a faster rate, they need to do more of the micro-structural reform. Macro and financial are okay right now, but the micro is not. That's why the potential growth rate of Brazil is lower than the other BRICS.
What micro reforms?
Many of them. There's probably excessive taxation in the economy. The size of the government in terms of spending is excessive. You need greater flexibility in labor markets. You have to reform the social security. You have to invest, more importantly, in two things. One, education, because the skill of the worker is not as much as it could be. Skill, education is important, better human capital. Two, you need also many more infrastructures. Public investment or private investment infrastructure, because that's a constraint. Whether it's energy or transportation or ports or others, you need both human capital and physical capital to grow very fast.
Is what happening the sweet revenge of the developing world?
In some sense, yes, because 10 years ago, the U.S. and advanced economies were telling to Brazil, Asia, Argentina, Russia, you have problems, your financial system is weak, your banks are weak, your governance is weak, your macro is weak, your finance is weak, you have to do this reform, that reform, that reform. And after the crisis of these economies, they did many of these macro and financial reform. Now they are stronger financial economic system. And the paradox is now the crisis started at the center of financial capitalism in the United States and the UK. The most advanced economies and financial markets now have a very severe crisis. It meant that some forms of crony capitalism and weaknesses were also at the center of the global financial capitalism. So in some sense it's almost like poetic justice or sweet revenge for emerging markets who are being beaten up by the US on all the bad things that they should be cleaning up. Now the US has to clean up its own mess.
And take their own remedies too.
Absolutely, and it's going to be painful to do all now the reforms and the belt tightenings to lead to cleaning up this big mess.
You say that there's light at the end of the tunnel. It's the light of a train exploding, right?
Well, so far I see the only light at the end of the tunnel, the one of the incoming train wreck, because we are really still in the middle of this economic and financial crisis. Hopefully, maybe the last action of really realizing you cannot do a step-by-step ad hoc. You need to have a systematic and holistic approach to the problem, admit we have a problem, because until now they kept on saying it's a small problem. Now they realize it's huge. The entire financial system this past week could have completely collapsed. We are one epsilon away from a financial and economic meltdown. We reached really the abyss. And now they've realized they have a big problem. Maybe now they're going to start to do what's right. The administration, the Congress, and everybody together to clean up the mess in the financial system. It's going to take time. It's going to be costly. It's going to be expensive. Maybe if we now realize we have a huge problem, we do something about it, we can avoid that total train wreck. It's going to be ugly. There's going to be a banking crisis. There's going to be a financial crisis. There's going to be economic recession. But maybe we're not going to end up like the Great Depression. It's going to be bad, but not as ugly.
You're an optimist.
I hope that we're going to do the right things, and actually in the medium term, I believe that there is a lot of potential growth for the global economy. The integration of countries like Brazil, Russia, China, India, and the global economy is very positive for long-run growth. So if the advance economy can clean up their mess. The global economy is going to be sounder, more balanced. That means also the balance of economic and power, or who's running the global economy cannot be anymore just the G7. You have to have all the other big players from Brazil, Russia, China, India, other emerging markets at the table, because the global economic issue, whether it's energy or imbalances or financial issues or environment or food crisis, they're global. And everybody has to work together to resolve this problem. If we work together, we can resolve them and we can grow fast. Otherwise, it's going to be a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Good talking to you.